In the heart of Africa, where red soil meets golden sun, a powerful voice once again rises from Burkina Faso, a voice that refuses to be silenced. Ibrahim Traoré, the young revolutionary leader who shocked the world, is now rallying nations toward one vision: true economic independence for all of Africa. From the bustling streets of Ouagadougou to the shining skylines of Lagos and Nairobi, a new rhythm is pulsing across the continent. It's not the sound of marching soldiers or foreign investors. It's the sound of awakening. Traoré's message is spreading like wildfire. Africa must own its wealth, its future, and its destiny. For too long, African economies have been trapped in invisible chains: loans disguised as aid, partnerships that were really domination, and corporations that drain the land while leaving its people poor. Traoré has seen it all. He's lived through the consequences. And now, he's tearing down the script that the West has written for Africa. It began quietly, in a meeting that few outsiders knew about. Leaders from several African nations gathered in a hidden chamber in Ouagadougou. No cameras, no Western observers, no advisors from the IMF or World Bank. What was discussed there would set the foundation for something bigger than any individual country: the African Economic Independence Plan. The plan was bold, daring, and, to many, impossible. But to Traoré, impossibility is just another word invented by those who benefit from your fear. The core idea was simple: stop depending on Western funding and start creating Africa's own capital system, by Africans, for Africans. The strategy began with gold. Burkina Faso's gold mines, once controlled by French and Canadian companies, would now be managed by the state and local cooperatives. Every ounce of gold taken from our soil must shine for our people first, Traoré declared. Similar discussions were happening in Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad. The young leaders of these countries, many inspired by Traoré's defiance, began forming a quiet alliance, one not signed in luxury hotels but sealed with trust and shared struggle. Together, they drafted a new economic map of Africa, one that erased the invisible borders of exploitation and redrew them around shared strength. Word spread quickly. Across the continent, citizens began to ask, if Burkina Faso can stand up to the West, why can't we? Fishermen in Ghana, miners in Congo, farmers in Ethiopia, everyone started to believe that Africa could finally feed itself, power itself, and rise by itself. The African Economic Independence Plan wasn't just about money. It was about mindset. It was about removing the illusion that progress requires permission. And as Traoré said during one fiery address to his cabinet, "They say we are too poor to be free. I say we are too powerful to stay poor." But of course, not everyone celebrated this idea. Western media outlets called it populist madness and economic suicide. Global financial institutions warned of catastrophic consequences for countries that dared to nationalize resources. Yet, for every warning issued in English or French, 1,000 voices in African languages shouted back in unity. And that unity, fragile, fierce, and growing, began to scare the world's superpowers. Intelligence reports from Washington, Paris, and Brussels started circulating quietly, African bloc forming under Traoré's leadership. What had started as a dream was now becoming a movement, and not even economic threats could stop it. By mid-year, over 10 African nations had expressed interest in joining the initiative. Economists predicted chaos, but what they didn't understand was that this was not about short-term profit. It was about long-term dignity. Traoré knew that the first generation to build this system might suffer, but the next would soar. He stood before a roaring crowd in Ouagadougou one evening, his voice echoing through the hot air. "Brothers and sisters, we are not fighting for luxury. We are fighting for liberation. When you eat what you grow, when you build what you need, when your children learn from your own history, then no empire can ever control you again." The crowd erupted, flags waved, the chants of Africa rising filled the night sky. But in Washington and Paris, boardrooms grew silent. Analysts whispered, "If this works, Africa will no longer need us." And that was exactly what Traoré wanted. As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, the city awoke not just to another day, but to a new era. The African Economic Independence Plan had entered its next stage, and Traoré was already 3 steps ahead of the world. In the heart of the capital, the newly established African Resource Council, a coalition of economists, engineers, and young innovators, gathered for a confidential session. No suits, no foreign advisors, just visionaries with determination burning in their eyes. Their mission: to build a self-sustaining economy that could never again be hijacked by foreign interests. Traoré entered the room quietly, his military uniform crisp, his face calm but fierce. He placed a single gold coin on the table. It glimmered under the dim lights, a symbol of both the continent's pain and its promise. "This," he said, tapping the coin, "has built empires not ours but theirs. It's time we use it to build our own." His words carried more weight than any speech before. Around him sat representatives from Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad, all leaders who had turned their backs on Western military alliances and foreign-funded aid. Each one nodded silently, knowing that the decision they were about to make would change the course of African history forever. Traoré continued, "We have been told that our gold, our oil, our diamonds, they need foreign expertise to be valuable. But brothers and sisters, value begins with ownership. We have everything we need. All we lack is the courage to take it back." The room fell into deep thought. These were not just political words, they were revolutionary blueprints. The first step was to establish a new African Development Fund, a bank owned entirely by African nations. Its purpose was not to borrow from the IMF or World Bank, but to fund African projects using African resources. Each nation would contribute based on its GDP and resource wealth. No Western capital, no strings attached. Within weeks, the plan went public. Western analysts mocked it as a fantasy. French and American media ran headlines like, "Traoré's dream faces harsh reality." Yet behind closed doors, intelligence briefings warned that African unity was gaining dangerous momentum. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger became the founding trio, soon dubbed the Sahel Bloc. Their governments agreed to share infrastructure, technology, and defense to protect their newfound sovereignty. Russia and China quietly observed, offering minor technical assistance but avoiding the role of puppet master. This was Africa's show, and Traoré was directing it. The Western response came swiftly. Sanctions were whispered, trade restrictions threatened, and private mining companies began pulling out their investments. But instead of panicking, Traoré smiled. He called a national broadcast. The cameras flickered on, and millions across the continent tuned in. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "They think without them we will collapse, but they forget it is we who have fed them, powered them, enriched them. Without Africa, there is no world economy." The broadcast spread like wildfire across African social media. Hashtags like Africa for Africans and Traoré movement trended for days. Youth movements in Kenya, Nigeria, and Tanzania started organizing online campaigns, urging their leaders to join the Sahel Bloc. In Ghana, students held rallies chanting, "Burkina Faso fights for all of us." In South Africa, economists began drafting proposals to connect southern trade routes to the bloc. What had started as a Burkina dream was now morphing into a continental revolution. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., policymakers were scrambling. Reports from the CIA warned of an unprecedented ideological shift in African governance. They couldn't comprehend how such a young leader, barely in his 30s, had managed to challenge the global order so effectively. At the same time, Traoré received a discreet message from a West African diplomat, a warning that certain powers were considering covert ways to destabilize the movement. He didn't flinch. "Let them come," he said quietly. "We have survived their bullets and their lies. We will survive their fear." The next phase of his plan was to integrate agriculture and manufacturing into the independence movement. Instead of exporting raw materials for pennies, Burkina Faso and its allies would process their own goods, cocoa, cotton, gold, oil directly on African soil. We are done being the world's supplier of cheap labor, Traoré declared. From now on, Africa exports finished power. Factories began to rise in Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Bamako. Not massive industrial complexes, but community-driven production units owned by local cooperatives. Each one carried the same message painted boldly on its walls. Built by Africans for Africa. It wasn't just economics, it was identity reborn. International observers mocked the initiative, predicting failure. But on the ground, hope was spreading faster than fear. For the first time in generations, African children were being taught that independence wasn't just political, it was economic, cultural, and psychological. Traoré's voice echoed across the continent. The day we stop asking for permission, that day, we become unstoppable. But as his message grew louder, so did the resistance. Western diplomats began pulling ambassadors, cutting aid, and funding opposition movements in neighboring states. Yet, every attempt to isolate him only made him a hero to millions. In markets, in schools, in villages, people whispered his name with pride, not as a president, but as a symbol. Traoré wasn't just leading Burkina Faso anymore. He was leading a movement, one that could redefine Africa's place in the world. And the world was beginning to tremble. In the following months, the African Economic Independence Plan ignited a fire across the continent. What began as an idea in Ouagadougou had now become a movement stretching from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Everywhere, people whispered the same name, Traoré. In a world dominated by the dollar and dictated by foreign contracts, a young captain from Burkina Faso had declared the unthinkable. Africa will no longer beg. Inside the newly formed Sahel Bloc headquarters, leaders from multiple nations sat around a massive table carved from Burkinabe mahogany. A golden map of Africa shone at its center, engraved with the words, "United we prosper." Traoré stood, his hands folded behind his back, eyes scanning the room. He spoke softly, but every word cut through the silence. "Brothers and sisters, for years they told us independence was given in 1960. But if they can still dictate our policies, own our resources, and control our currency, then tell me, are we free?" Murmurs filled the room. A leader from Mali replied, "We are not free, but we are no longer asleep." Traoré smiled. "Then let's wake up the rest of Africa." With that, the council began drafting the African Resource Charter. A framework to guarantee that every deal signed within the bloc would prioritize local ownership, fair trade, and long-term sustainability. Western corporations panicked. Emails leaked from mining lobbies in Paris and London revealing plans to undermine regional stability through targeted economic pressure. But it was already too late. The momentum was unstoppable. Burkina Faso's national bank, once heavily dependent on French reserves, officially transitioned its first transaction through the African Development Fund, bypassing the euro completely. It was a symbolic act, but a powerful one. International media labeled it economic suicide. Yet, 3 weeks later, gold prices surged, and Burkina Faso reported record profits from domestic refining. Traoré didn't boast. He knew this was only the beginning. One evening, during a national address, he appeared not as a soldier but as a teacher of destiny. His tone calm, his conviction unshakable. "My people, they will tell you we are too small, too poor, too weak. But the truth is, we have been made to believe that lie for too long. Our soil is rich, our hearts are strong, and our minds are awakening. Together, we are limitless." That night the streets erupted in chants. In Ouagadougou, people lit candles in front of the presidential palace. Some cried, others danced. It wasn't about politics anymore, it was about pride. Meanwhile, in Washington, the atmosphere was tense. A high-level meeting at the Pentagon gathered generals, analysts, and diplomats. Satellite images of construction sites in Burkina Faso flashed across the screen. Solar plants, gold refineries, and railways connecting Sahel nations. A senior advisor leaned forward. "Sir, this isn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. This is an anti-Western economic revolution. If it spreads, Africa could become a new power bloc and we'd lose our influence. A cold silence filled the room. The U.S. had underestimated the young Burkina leader. They thought he was just another populist. But Traoré wasn't chasing fame. He was building a future. Back in Africa, a new initiative called Made in the Sahel launched, encouraging nations to produce and export locally manufactured goods. From textiles in Niger to processed gold in Mali, the African supply chain was forming, independent, defiant, and proud. For the first time, Burkina companies signed export contracts with other African nations, not Europe. The trade ministers of Nigeria and Ethiopia expressed interest in joining the bloc. Rumors even spread that Tanzania was considering aligning its central bank with the African Development Fund. Every new step tightened the West's anxiety. France froze pending transactions. The IMF suspended dialogue. The World Bank threatened to withhold development loans. But Traoré's response was simple. Let them keep their loans. We are investing in dignity. Those 5 words became a slogan across social media, painted on walls, printed on t-shirts, whispered in classrooms. In Lagos, a young activist tweeted, "Traoré is teaching us what true leadership looks like." In Johannesburg, university students began organizing panels titled Africa Beyond Aid. And in Nairobi, a viral video showed schoolchildren reciting Traoré's quote in unison. The message was clear: Africa was done bowing. Then came the unexpected twist. Russia quietly sent an economic delegation to Ouagadougou, offering technical expertise in mining and defense infrastructure. China soon followed, proposing investments in renewable energy. But Traoré was cautious. He made it clear that Burkina Faso would not trade one master for another. In a meeting with the Russian ambassador, he said, "Partnerships, yes. Dependence, never again." That single line was broadcast across international media and instantly became a defining moment. It was no longer about East versus West. It was about Africa defining its own path. The next week, Traoré convened another council, this time broadcast live. Millions tuned in. He stood at the podium, flanked by the flags of the Sahel nations. "My brothers and sisters across Africa," he began, his voice calm yet filled with fire. "The time of waiting is over. We no longer ask for a seat at their table. We are building our own. And this table will be carved from African wood, laid upon African soil, and shared by African hands." Applause thundered through the hall. Even outside the country, screens flickered with emotion. In cafes, markets, and living rooms, people watched history unfold. By the time he finished, one message echoed everywhere: Africa is awake, and we are never going back to sleep. But with that awakening came danger. Western intelligence agencies began warning of economic sabotage and proxy conflicts brewing. Opposition figures, funded from abroad, started trying to stir unrest online. Traoré knew it was coming. His advisors urged caution, but he smiled, saying, "They can infiltrate our systems, not our souls." As Burkina Faso entered the next stage of its revolution, one thing was certain: Traoré wasn't leading a rebellion. He was leading a rebirth, and the world was watching in silence, afraid to admit that Africa's time had truly begun. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou. The air was warm, thick with the sound of drums and the smell of burning incense. It wasn't just another evening, it was the closing chapter of a century-long story of resistance. Across the city, banners waved high: Africa for Africans, dignity over dependence. Crowds filled the capital, awaiting their leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man who had defied the West, broken the chains of economic control, and lit a fire that was now burning across the continent. He stood backstage, hands clasped, watching the horizon glow gold. Advisors whispered, journalists prepared, the crowd chanted his name. But for a few seconds he was silent. His gaze was fixed on the flag fluttering in the distance, the red, green, and gold of Burkina Faso. He closed his eyes and whispered, "My ancestors fought with swords, I fight with truth." Moments later, he walked to the podium. The chanting stopped. The silence was electric. Cameras zoomed in. Every word he was about to say would ripple far beyond Burkina Faso. It would echo through Africa, through the halls of power in Washington, Paris, and London. He raised his hand and began. My brothers and sisters, today, we stand not as beggars but as builders. For years, they told us we could not survive without them. They said our freedom was dangerous, our ambition reckless, our independence impossible. But here we are, alive, proud, and unbroken. The crowd erupted. Some waved flags, others cried. He continued, his voice steady and fierce. They gave us aid but took our gold. They gave us loans but stole our land. They called it partnership, we call it plunder. But today, we end this cycle of humiliation. From this day forward, Africa will not ask for permission to rise. Thunderous applause. He paused, then leaned forward, almost whispering into the microphone. They built their empires with our blood. They wrote their history books with our silence. But now, it is our turn to write in ink made from our pride and our pain. From the crowd, chants broke out. Traoré, Africa, freedom. He raised his hand again. No, my brothers, this is not about me. It's about us. About every child who walks barefoot to school, about every farmer who tills the land and feeds the world, about every mother who prays for a future where her children won't have to cross oceans for survival. This is their revolution. He gestured to the crowd, his voice growing in rhythm. They told us we needed their dollars, but we have gold. They told us we needed their soldiers, but we have courage. They told us we needed their systems, but we have wisdom, African wisdom that has survived storms, slavery, and centuries of deceit. The entire crowd roared. Cameras captured the emotion, men in uniforms crying, women waving traditional scarves, children chanting slogans they barely understood but deeply felt. In that moment, it wasn't just Burkina Faso celebrating. It was Africa reborn. Across the continent, screens flickered. From Kinshasa to Kampala, from Lagos to Lusaka, millions watched live. Social media exploded with one word: freedom. Meanwhile, in Washington, a group of analysts sat in disbelief. One whispered, he's not just leading a country, he's awakening a continent. In Paris, an emergency meeting was called. The finance minister looked grim. If this movement continues, our influence in West Africa will collapse completely, he said. But it was already too late. The tide had turned. Back in Ouagadougou, the crowd began chanting in unison. Africa unite, Africa unite. Traoré smiled, his eyes scanning the people who believed in something bigger than politics, something spiritual, ancestral, eternal. He raised his voice one last time. They can freeze our accounts, but never our courage. They can block our borders, but never our belief. Because our greatest resource is not oil, not gold, not diamonds. It is our unity. The chant grew louder and louder, shaking the ground itself. Then he said the word that would be remembered across generations. They built their world on our suffering. Now we will build our future on our freedom. From this moment on, Africa will no longer bow. Africa will lead. The sky cracked with thunder, as if the heavens themselves were answering his call. That night across Burkina Faso, lights shone late into the evening. People gathered around radios, phones, and televisions, repeating his words again and again. Africa will lead. In Mali, soldiers saluted his speech. In Ghana, students painted murals of his face alongside Kwame Nkrumah. In South Africa, commentators called it the speech of a century. And somewhere in the shadows, the same powers that once ruled Africa sat in silence, realizing something terrifying. Their time of control was ending, and the new Africa was rising. As dawn broke over the continent, the winds carried a whisper, soft but powerful. From the mountains of Ethiopia to the plains of Burkina Faso, people felt the shift. This was no longer about one man or one nation. It was about a continent reclaiming its destiny. Traoré returned to his office that night, exhausted but at peace. He looked at a map of Africa glowing faintly under the light. His aide asked softly, "Sir, what's next?" Traoré smiled. "What's next? We build, we educate, we empower. We plant seeds that our grandchildren will harvest." He paused, then added, "Tell the world, the African century has begun." And with that, he turned off the light. The camera slowly zooms out of the presidential palace. The music swells, a mix of African drums and deep violins. The screen fades to black. If you believe Africa deserves to rise to own its destiny, its wealth, and its voice, then subscribe right now, because this is only the beginning. More truth, more power, more Africa. Subscribe and stay awake.